And another portion of it that's even more interesting than just the laws of Plymouth Colony are the cases that developed the laws, the reason that the laws came into existence, and who the people were that caused the laws to come into existence, you know.
So we all try to sit together. So
well, you certainly can.
Yeah.
No problem about that. I'm getting all warmed up now. I just didn't take my coat off like that. But if you're here tonight, you have to be history buffs, people that are interested in history.
Absolutely.
Because, as I say, the laws of Plymouth Colony sounds like an extremely dry topic. And I have found that it's the basis of our whole country, what we are based on. And you will absolutely, unless Edwina has told you what the first law is, you're all going to be surprised. Absolutely surprised. But let me do a little of my reading in the introduction instead of just talking off the top of my head, because I can talk all day long and you have to listen. Any expertise that I've been able to achieve over the years in working with genealogies of the early arrivals in Plymouth Colony has been due to my geographical location as a resident of Plymouth County. This close proximity to Plymouth has enabled me to have easy access to the early records of Plymouth Colony, which were located in the County Commissioner's Office, as well as the county records at the Probate and Registry of Deeds, the Court of Common Pleas, and the General Sessions, prior to their removal to Boston. Of particular interest to me were the early criminal cases, which have never been fully examined and will, without doubt, provide interest to us as descendants when and if they are ever transcribed, because you know that our ancestors were not angels. The existence of these cases led me to an interest in the laws on which the conviction of indiscretions were based. It made me wonder how many of those actions were so well-founded that they still exist or benefit the public today. The answer was surprising. In order to introduce you to the topic involving the laws of Plymouth Colony, it's necessary to review a bit of the early history. As you are well aware, the first permanent colony in the New World was the settlement of the Pilgrims at Plymouth in November of 1620. I'm not going to go into the Mayflower voyage because I'm sure you all have heard that one before. This colony was composed of individuals seeking religious freedom, and while Plymouth Colony may have been the smallest and the weakest of all the English colonies survived in America, it was responsible for making some of the earliest and most valuable contributions to the American legal system. The list of Mayflower passengers has been duly recorded by William Bradford in his History of Plymouth Plantation. And I don't know whether you have a copy of that downstairs, but I hope you do. Arriving in a land far from the seat of any legal government, the Pilgrims were acutely aware that they might have a problem. Their charter, entitled The Great Patent of New England, had been granted by King James and drawn for the settlement in the northern section of Virginia. But the Mayflower had landed many miles to the north of the grant, so there were some among the members who claimed they would not be legally governed. Without a charter, they were thrown upon their own resources to provide a government for themselves. Less than half of their numbers were saints or members of the separatist group, so they were not going to be bound together by religious affiliation. The more civilized suspected that the dissenters were bound to arise, and there would be no one in official capacity to whom they could appeal. Thus, knowing that they would be entirely dependent on themselves for law and order, the enactment of rules became essential for their well-being. Out of necessity for survival, before making the permanent land settlement, the Pilgrim colonists covenanted and combined into a body politic and declared by virtue thereof that they did enact, constitute, and frame some just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, and constitutions that would be most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. This instrument, of course, was called the Mayflower Compact, and you've all heard of it. It was signed by all the adult free men and set forth the obligations and the duties of the people to the colony. It was simple yet comprehensive, an agreement that was the basis of the first American Constitution, and following the American Revolutionary War, became the foundation of our present democracy. Devising and improving the compact, the colonists succeeded in establishing a self-governing community without benefit of a royal charter, a royal proprietor, or a corporate overlord. And in this respect, they evinced an early political maturity, which was not matched in any other American colony. They also succeeded in establishing a system of law to suit the situation and condition in which they found themselves. At first, the Pilgrims did not endorse the present-day belief on the system of free enterprise, that each should reap the rewards of his own labor. All work was allotted, and all food and provisions were placed in the community storehouse, in which all would share alike. It was the collectivist's dream, but human nature being what it was, the crucible in which all social and economic theories are ruthlessly tested, quickly asserted itself. Bradford's history records that the practice of share and share alike brought much confusion and discontent, and retarded much employment that would have been to their comfort and benefit. The young men that were able and fit for labor and service, such as John Alden and Miles Standish, did repine that they had spent their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without recompense. Thereafter, following much debate, each family was assigned a parcel of land on which to plant their own crops and prosper or suffer according to their ability and to labor and produce goods needed by other individuals. These are all recorded in Volume 12 of the Records of New Plymouth, and I suspect you're probably familiar with them. For the survival of the colony and better government of people, from time to time, beginning in 1623, new orders were agreed on, and they have been a subject to interest to me, and I hope that they will be items of trivia and interest to you. These laws have been collected into a book called The Compact, Charter, and Laws of Old Plymouth Colony. They preserve the laws as near their original form as possible. The work is divided into three parts. The first part with the establishment of the colony until 1658. The second portion has all of the laws from 1658 to the union of the colony with the Massachusetts Bay, and the final section contains laws which they went over and revised. These records of Plymouth also provide information on the family group and the extent to which they affected others within the group, such as creditors and debtors. The interrelationships between individuals are defined by laws regulating business and private interests, so that none should intrude upon the rights of others. The necessity for laws to guide and control strangers, as well as members of the colony, also informs us of the social evolution of the colony. The basic problems of concern in Old Plymouth Colony were reflected in the enactment of laws governing land, inheritance, crime, laying out pathways, weights and measures, licensing of innkeepers, welfare situations, and personal conduct in regards to drinking, smoking, swearing, lying, marriage, and church attendance. These laws were designed to keep good order and benefit the entire community by placing restraints on the individuals who might get out of control. How well were these laws written, and how well did they withstand the passing of time? Let us examine some of them and see. And we'll start right with the early ones in 1623. The first law on the book is one which you are all familiar. Does anyone have any idea what the nature of it is? I'm going to give you a clue. Every one of you has been called upon to participate in carrying it to justice.
Jury duty.
Jury duty, exactly. Certainly you're familiar with the provision for trial by jury. Under English law, the jury system applied only to the nobility and the landowners. The colonists extended it to include all men. Provision for trial by jury of one's peers has existed since 17 December 1623. Think of that. All this time it's been on the books. The general court then held that all criminal facts and all matters of trespass and debts between man and man should be tried by the verdict of 12 honest men to be impaneled by authority in the form of a jury upon their oath. The criminal were to be tried by the grand jury and the capital by petty jury. And they also determined that no one should be condemned without a second witness, and no one could be required to indict himself. And we saw that carried forth as the Fifth Amendment. How many times have you heard people take the Fifth? And this was enacted in 1623. Isn't it amazing? The second law appears to have been devised in order to protect the growth and development of the colony. It pertains to the exportation of timber for house frames, plank boards for shipping, shallop boats, canoes, etc. Such an act was prohibited, and violators were fined and the material forfeited. This law was so important to the viability of the colony that it was reviewed and reenacted in 1636 and again in 1658. Of additional concern was the control of the work of the handicraftsmen, such as the tailors, the shoemakers, carpenters, joiners, smiths, sawyers, etc., who were forbidden to work for strangers until the necessities of the colony had been served. Special interest in inheritance laws provided provision of descent to all of the children, rather than follow the rule of primogeniture as practiced in England, whereby the oldest son received the lion's share of the inheritance of land. The Pilgrims also instituted laws which provided for the widow to have a life estate of 1/3 of all the land, which her husband possessed at the time of his death, as well as assuring the widow of an absolute interest in 1/3 of his goods and chattels. Land holdings were accounted for by deeds pertaining to the recording of sales of land, gifts, mortgages, and other conveyances of house and land in entirety or by portion. With singular, their appurtenance in every part and parcel thereof, in the manner of East Greenwich, in the county of Kent, England. In the absence of a will, the accuracy or the orderliness of recording the description of a specific piece of land has often resulted in the identification of family relationships. These rules pertaining to the recording of deeds are still in effect today. It should also be noted that as in the early days of the colony, the deeds once again pertain to the recording of a sale of only a portion of a building or a residence. We have come full circle, and again, today, we sell a portion of a building. It's now referred to as a condo unit. Now, I'm going to thumb through a little of this book and tell you some of the other laws that came into existence early on. They decided to elect a governor when they first came here, and this was fine for several years. But people began to get busy with other interests, and somehow they decided that if anyone was elected to serve as the governor or an assistant or any other thing, and they refused to serve, that they could be fined. So that would almost assure, but then they felt that was unfair and that they had to pay some compensation to this individual because they could not be working to support their family at that time, and so they made a provision that they could allot a certain amount to each person that served. They also found that in 1632, the first fort that they had built was beginning to deteriorate. It had not been built as well as it might, and that it would have to be rebuilt. And so they passed a law that everyone of the ancient comers had to work on the new fortification. And every person in the colony had to labor and aid in the development of this new fort. And at this time, they were bringing over materials from England, and they decided that every person was to be provided with arms and ammunition who was able to bear them. So they were still a little annoyed by wild animals and by the creatures they called the Indians. In 1633, we have begun to be a little bit idle now, have some idle time, and the person whose house anyone is found drunk is to be fined. So if you came to my house and you imbibed just a little too much, we were going to fine me for serving you that night. And do we not have something like that on the records today? You hear it all the time. Somebody goes out and they were served too much liquor at an establishment. We're finding the people who serve the liquor. Food was very important to these people still, and that they said that there would be, the herrings and shad were to be appropriated for the use of the inhabitants of Plymouth and not for some of the other towns. In 1633, we're beginning to find that the pilgrims some of the older pilgrims are dying off, and they have now accumulated some possessions here in America. They have some land, and depending on their ability to be industrious, they have other items of interest. And so they decided that wills had to be made to determine by the individual, when they were in a sound mind, where their property or how it was to be dispensed. And the wife was to administer on the estate, something which you could not do in England. The women were beginning to receive a few privileges. And if a person died, an administrator of the estate and was appointed if they had no kindred here. Some people came over and died of different diseases the first year they got here. They may have accumulated some things, or they may have been mariners who had some items that should be returned to family, and they didn't know what to do with them, so they appointed an administrator to look after their estate. When the personal estate of a deceased person was insufficient to pay their debts, then the real estate may be sold. And this happened in another lecture I give. I can tell you how these things came in when someone died, because I can tell you the name of the person who died without being able to. He died young and unexpectedly because he was hit by a tree limb when he was riding his horse. And naturally, he was so young, he had not made a will. He did not feel it was necessary. But he owed money that he had, and money was owed to him for services that he had rendered. And so instead of just forgetting everything because he was dead, they said, well, now he has an estate, and we'll look it over. But the money that he had earned was not sufficient to pay for the food and other items that he had, so they had to sell some of the real estate that he owned and meet all of his debts. Oh yes, we're up to the point where we now have lots of cattle coming over, we have swine, we have other roosters and things like this, and these animals, of course, we didn't have any means of controlling them. They just wandered around the yard, and if your animals got into somebody else's crop, then you had to make good. There was a law come on the books that you had to make good for the damage that your animal did to the other person's crop. Firing of the woods at certain seasons. You could, by the new order, you could set fire if you were burning brush or clearing property between the month of September and the month of March. Now we have on the books, and it's still been on the books, and in all of the towns around here, you can get burning permits at certain seasons of the year, but you can't get them at other seasons. And I think probably April is the end of the what they call the open burning season. The firemen can tell you a little more about that. And these animals that saw fit to roam, we always didn't know who they belonged to. And so the law was made that each town had to establish a pound. Does Plumpton have a pound? No? Well, Pembroke, I know, has one. Scituate has one. There's several of them that are still left that have not been destroyed. And you see they're at the level of land, and then you go down, and there's a stone wall all around them. And that's where they put the animal. If he ate your crop, you seized the animal, brought him down to the town pound. And he had to, the animal remained in the town pound until you made restitution to the individual whose crop he had munched on. And then you could get your animal out of the pound and take him home again. So the pounds were quite important in those days. And while most towns haven't kept them, they served a specific purpose. We find that in 1635, we are now no longer drinking pure water from the streams, but the ships are bringing over wine. And the sale of wine was prohibited. And you could give one cup to a stranger who came at their first coming, not to exceed the value of 2 pence a person, so that you were not going to get someone inebriated by welcoming them to your home with a drink of wine. So those are the laws up until about 1636. And then we go on. Prior to 1636, there really had been few laws made, and still few were committed to the records. But each one was based on a specific case. Something happened in the colony, and therefore they had, or they felt it necessary to make a law to cover it should it happen again. The people acted as a voluntary association governing by majority vote rather than as a political community guided and controlled by standing laws. However, as the colony expanded with inhabitants, the General Court decided to review all of the laws on record in order to determine the worthiness of retaining the same and the necessity of defining more clearly the rights and privileges of the members of the growing community. In October of 1636, a committee was appointed for collecting and revising the laws, which is the second portion of this book. On the committee were the governor and assistants William Brewster, Ralph Smith, John Doane, and John Denny of Plymouth, Jonathan Brewster and Christopher Wadsworth from Duxbury, and James Cudwood and Anthony Annable from Scituate. And these were what we call the town fathers, and they came together to meet, and they decided that some laws needed to be revised. And when the laws were revised, they became known as the Code of 1636. And the existing laws were enhanced to set forth the general basis of the framework of the colony's government. This mini-bill, or Bill of Rights, outlined legislative power sources, the authority and duty of the colony officers, provisions for calling the court to order, and even went so far as to define the authority for declaring war. This early work of law provided a code which antedated by 5 years the rules regulating Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they really were on the ball. They established a constitution which made lasting contributions to modern law in the United States. Without doubt, you've all heard of the Freeman's Oath. Have you not? The Freeman's Oath? Well, it's a big thing. We're always talking about the Freeman's Oath. And actually, I didn't know that much about the Freeman's Oath until I came upon this book here. And before we go into the Freeman's Oath, I'm going to tell you a few more things. No ordinance or law could be made without the consent of the freemen. So all these freemen got together. They're like the voters in the town, and they could make the law. They decided that the election was to be on the first Tuesday of March in each year. Well, we sort of hold the town meeting in the winter months of March or April when not so much is going on.
Excuse me, but did they have to own land in order to vote?
I'm going to tell you about this in a minute. You're ahead of me. The governor and the 7 assistants were chosen each year by election of the freemen only, so that new people who came into the town weren't allowed to vote. The clerk, they were to choose a clerk and a coroner. But now the freeman's oath. You shall be truly loyal to our sovereign Lord, King Charles, his heirs and successors. You shall not speak or do, devise or advise anything or things, acts directly or indirectly by land or water that doth, shall, or may tend to the destruction or overthrow of this plantation, colonies, corporations of New Plymouth. Neither shall you suffer the same to be spoken or done, but shall hinder, oppose, and discover the same to the governor and assistants of the said colony for the time being, or some one of them. You shall faithfully submit unto such good and wholesome laws and ordinances as either are or shall be made for the ordering and government of the same. You shall endeavor to advance the growth and good of the several plantations within the limits of this corporation by all due means and courses, all which you promise and swear by the name of the great God of heaven and earth, simply and truly and faithfully to perform, as you hope for help from God, who is the God of truth and the punisher of falsehood. So basically, you did not have to own land to be a freeman. And I find it interesting that you make a pledge, really, of allegiance to the country and the king. And we still have a Pledge of Allegiance, which I don't know how much it's worth these days because it's not being recited in the schools by the children, and the children don't really know how we felt in the old days about this. So let's see, where are we going from here?
So, just as a reference, freeman is any male person above a certain age who is voting, who could vote.
He could vote because he was a freeman. When he was made freeman, he then could vote. He had to take this oath of allegiance to the king and to the colony.
So it was done probably at a certain age?
They had to be 18 years of age, of course. But he did not have to own land. See, now that was one of the big things in England, which caused a lot of controversy because the laws were made by those that owned the land. And if you didn't own the land in England, you didn't mean anything. And here, the law applies to everyone.
So it's basically being a registered voter, a freeman.
So, you can see how things have changed from England, and how they've changed, but they remain the same.
There's a term you use there, plantations, even in Maine today. When you get up into the wilds of Maine,
You still have plantations.
plantations. Yeah.
They have never been incorporated as towns. They do not have enough
And
inhabitants.
all that is a whole different perspective there than here in Massachusetts, although, of course, Maine was.
Massachusetts until 1820. So, but I just find these rules and regulations so interesting, and how you can see how other laws in the United States have developed, and how our Constitution is based on many of the things that were developed.
I had a young man give me a book, David Barton's book, Original Intent.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure familiar with it. And you're in that time frame, and around 16 and 40 in Massachusetts, they enacted the Duluth-Satan law, which was mandated that when a village got to be a specific size, someone in the village would have to teach the young people to read, so that they would not be scripturally illiterate. I think that, as David Barton mentioned that in his book, I think that's, as it pertains to today, I mean, how far have we come in these 300 years or so?
We won't get into that one because I have some strong feelings about education. At this time, we're now into the time frame of, I think it's 1638, but I want to make sure that I don't see a date here. Okay, well, it is about 1638 or 1640. We find that people in the colony we now have so many people coming into the colony that we have some people that are rebellious. And that in every town, and we had Scituate, Marshfield, Duxbury, and towns like that besides Plymouth, that there should be a pair of stocks erected in each town. Also a cage which shall be of competent strength to detain a prisoner, and a whipping post, and these to be erected in such places as shall be thought meet by the several neighborhoods where they concern, upon the penalty of 10 shillings for any township which shall be defective herein. So each town was beginning to have citizens which were not respecting the law, and somehow they had to detain them. They were also to have a constable in charge of the highways. If the highway went by your door, you were to maintain the section in front of your house, and in the time that you spent repairing the road, you were to be compensated. All persons were to take the oath of allegiance, and again, as I say, this is equivalent to our Pledge of Allegiance today. Now, there were what they considered capital offenses, and a capital offense was liable to death. Treason or rebellion against the person of the king, state, or commonwealth, either of England or of these colonies. And I don't believe that they actually ever found anyone guilty of treason in Plymouth Colony. Willful murder. Solemn compaction and conversing with the devil by way of witchcraft. Willful or proposed burning of ships' houses. Sodomy, rapes, or buggery, and adultery. Now, these were all capital offenses, and you were liable for death for them. The willful murder, of course, we know came about with the Billington case. And if people are descendants of John Billington, you know, they feel that they have been very much, or John may have been maligned. And 100, you know, we're living, 375 years later? We can't say. But of course, Mr. Billington found several times that John Newcomb had raided his traps. He warned Mr. Newcomb, and evidently he was a man with a short fuse, and he found him at his traps one day, and he shot him, and poor John Newcomb succumbed. And this was such a horrific thing at that day. They didn't know what to do, and even the people in the colony were divided whether he should be put to death or not. They couldn't determine themselves, evidently, whether it was an accidental shooting or one on purpose. And they even went outside of the colony to the Mass Bay and consulted with the governor of Mass Bay to see what they should do. And we all know it resulted in the death of John. But I want to tell you that the Billington family should also be credited with the fact that young John, in May of 1621, when the winter snows were gone, and he was just a teenager, he left Plymouth Colony, or Plymouth proper, and set about discovering different things in Plymouth. And he went south, and he went so far south that he got lost. And after several days out there, 2 or 3 days, he came across some Indians from the Cape Cod plantation, and they were closer to their plantation, so they took him back to their Indian reservation. They sent word to Plymouth that they had them, and the governor sent 3 or 4 men down to Cape Cod Indian reservation to bring young John home. And on this trip of communicating back and forth, they became somewhat friendly with the Indians. The Indians then in turn sent another group up to the plantation, and they entertained them royally. And this was the start of a good friendship between the people, just because this little child was lost. And while Daddy might have done something that we can't condone, certainly the child may have brought some good luck to the plantation. We can't deny that. Fornication and other unclean carriages were to be punished by the discretion of the magistrates, according to the nature thereof. Fornication before contract or marriage, or this had one connotation here, but that isn't explained until further down in the record. All sales of land were to be acknowledged before the governor or assistant, because many people had been, when the land was parceled out, the governor had the land surveyed. They were set up in different parcels of like 20 acres each. And then you drew lots. And if you didn't like your lot, or you wanted to be close to your brother, then you would trade your lot with another. Well, a lot of this trading went on that was not recorded. And so they were beginning to find that they actually needed records to show how the land had transferred from one person to another. The cattle now are becoming so numerous that they had to be marked. If my cattle strayed, my cow looked like your cow, and so-and-so down the street didn't know the difference between the two, and he was claiming my cow was the one that ate his crop, and it wasn't, it was somebody else's cow. So they now decided that each man would have their own crop mark, and I don't know whether they usually was a punch or a hole in the ear or a couple of slices on the outside of one ear or another, and they registered all of these marks. And these can be found if you're interested in seeing them. They are in the records. The widow's portion of the third of her real estate during her life, and 1/3 of the personal estate. And she was going to be able to, if it was a life estate, then of course she could not hand it on to anyone else. It went back, it reverted to the members of the family. They decided that some of the weights and measures weren't up to standard, and they decided the Winchester standard of England was to be used. The General Court was given orders that they could make war and peace, and this one I find extremely interesting. All the soldiers, people were to be pressed into service. And it tells how they were to be impressed and how old they should be. And that it says here, provided if any that shall go return maimed or hurt, he shall be maintained completely by the colony during his life. Now we have men and women that are going off to Iraq that are coming home, and I believe they get $6,000 compensation for a death, and I don't know what they get for loss of limb or limb, but I see all these programs on the television that many of them are in the Walter Reed Hospital, but we are still maintaining them and we're still taking care of them. Again, this was provided back in the 1640s, and it's still carrying forward. It's wonderful to know that we're willing to take care of our people that way. Marriage. None shall be allowed to marry that are under the covert of parents, but by the parents' consent. In case the consent cannot be had, then it shall be with the consent of the governor or assistant to whom the persons are known. And then they had to publish their bans 3 times so that all of the people could object if they wanted to. And many times they brought from a church where they were a letter of clearance saying that they had resided in another state and that they were not engaged or obligated to some other woman, and that they could find a wife in Plymouth Colony. Because if they were newly come to the colony, you didn't know about the background. there were, sheep were becoming plentiful. They said no sheep could be sold out of the colony. Now, they decided that as spring came and the swine were now roaming freely around the country, that they had to be ringed or yoked to keep them from invading somebody else's property. They're having too many instances where they were invading the property. And they decided if you did not yoke or ring your swine, you were going to pay 2 shillings for every week that you did not comply with the law. So there was a certain way to make you comply. It was voluntary, but you could pay the money if you didn't wish to do so. If you had it, I guess. Wolves were very troublesome at this time, and full bushels of corn were to be paid to a person who shall kill a wolf. No guns or iron traps to be set near the highway. Wine and water to be sold only in inns and victualling houses. Now, you could not, if someone came by your door and was traveling and wanted a drink, you couldn't sell them a drink. It were only certain places, and this is where the highway inns began to come into existence in the colony. Children and servants were not allowed to spend their time in a victualling house. And again, we have the rule that you're supposed to be 18 years of age to be a drinker or imbibing, and if you're under 18, you can't do it. So these things are still carrying forward to you. Servants that have come out of their time were to have 5 acres of land. If you brought someone over from England and they worked their passage off in your home, when they were through their indenture, then the government were going to give them 5 acres of land so that they could start out here and become a good citizen. Also, if you had land which had been allotted to you and you had drawn in the lottery and it was not occupied by the person to whom they were granted and improved, the land had to be given back to the government. And they had different fees that you had to pay. If you were going to announce your wedding, to give the notice of your wedding, you had to pay a fine of 12 pence to the government. And this was, if you had a dispute with your neighbor and you wanted to bring him into court, there was a fine of 2 shillings, 6 pence to have the notice served on someone. When the man came around to make sure that the measures in the colony were correct, there was a fee that was paid to him for checking on things like that.